Right at this time, we're broadcasting at 9 a.m. for half an hour, at noon for half an hour, and on Tuesdays for an hour and a half. It makes me extremely happy. I feel like I'm having a party with all my friends all the time, even though we're exceedingly isolated. When I have the opportunity to travel, which I do sometimes, I just really have no responsibilities except just to share with others what Swami gave to me, and I always feel like I'm right in the center of who I'm supposed to be when I'm doing that, whether it's writing or speaking. Writing is a solitary pursuit. Usually speaking is a social pursuit, but speaking has become a solitary pursuit too. Although I feel the presence of those not only who are listening in real time, even time, but actually somehow those who are going to receive it later. It's a very interesting connectedness. Swami Kriyananda talked about this to me when he was recording television shows for India in 2004, probably, after he moved to India. And he was talking to a camera. There was there was a few people in the room, but there was no live stream. He was just recording programs that would be shared over the next year. But he said he could feel the consciousness of the people who would receive it. And he felt himself being guided by that consciousness. It's pretty hard to sort of even think about how that works. And even then he was thinking of, at least he was talking about, the television audience who would receive it in the moment. But now those programs, which is called The Way of Awakening, it's based on this book. It's Swami Kriyananda's commentary on this book, The Way of Awakening. He doesn't do it, I don't believe he didn't do it chronologically the way I did. He would select different ones, and he would have one selected for each day, and then he would have a song that would go with it. But now they're on the internet, and I watch them often because I really enjoy them. And somehow or another, it's a very real living exchange. I think there's so much about this, the interrelationship of the forces of consciousness on this planet, that we just have no idea. We're just children with this. I've told this story, I believe, to a camera, but I'm going to tell it again because I love it. There was a Swami Dhirananda who was a very good childhood friend of Yogananda. And when Master came to America, he sent for Dhirananda, and Dhirananda became his basically second in charge. But in the end, Yogananda chose to marry and left Mount Washington and actually sued Master for back wages. It was quite the big thing that happened in Los Angeles in the courts, and it was played up really big in the newspaper. It was quite a story. And eventually Dhirananda became a professor at some university, Michigan or Minnesota or something like that. And because he'd had so much experience about yoga, he ended up being a brain researcher, some scientific medical research. And he had this idea that to do his research, because academicians, have to do original things, he went back to India with his machines that could measure brain waves, and he contacted this Swami Purushothamananda, who was a well-known, very much respected, very advanced disciple of a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, if I have that correct. I'm pretty sure that's his lineage. Swami Purushothamananda, Swami Kriyananda visited him in the 1958-62 period when Swami was in India. Purushothamananda lived at this place called Vasishtha Gufa, which is a cave outside of Rishikesh. Swami Kriyananda spent some time nearby. So Dhirananda contacts Purushothamananda. He wants to come, he wants to bring his machine, he wants to measure his brain waves, he's going to show all this, which is very interesting, all of it. They want to come on a certain day. Purushothamananda says that's really not a good day to come, but they insisted that was the schedule, so the Swamiji allowed them to come, and they came, and if I remember correctly, they couldn't get any of their machinery to work. And so they came back the next day, which was the day that the Swamiji had suggested, and they hooked him up like this. And then he's sitting there, and they've got their machine, they know it's working, but there's just nothing registering. They're not getting any readings at all. And they sort of are agitated about this, and the Swamiji says, "Oh, you want brain waves?" And then all of a sudden the machines are just going crazy because he's just doing all these crazy brain waves. And then it comes back down to normal. And then the Swami looks at them and he says, you so-called scientists, he said, you're just children. You don't know anything about consciousness. It's such a, there's so many parts of that that are, who knows? But, what do we know about consciousness? What do we really know about consciousness? You have things like the Book of Brigu, which was written, hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago, which specifically names the names of people and details of their lives that cannot be fabricated, that cannot be interchangeable. And you can go to these various pundits in India and they'll look up, and if they have a reading for you, they don't have a reading for everyone, but if they have a reading for you, they'll just tell you who you are. It's just, it makes mincemeat out of everything that we think. And it's, it's a good wake-up call to realize that our little sphere of concern is just a speck. It's just a piece of dust on the great ocean of consciousness. And when we are caught, as we are presently caught in this very peculiar cycle now we're April, now we're all the way into April 2020, where we're all housebound and masked up when we go outside and waiting to see, for the epidemic to crest and then see what's going to happen. But it's a dust mote on the realm of eternity. And even though egoically we're so identified with the moment, it does not feel like a dust mote. From the perspective of real consciousness, who can say? I find that, I don't always find that sufficient to shift my awareness, but I never forget that it's true. And so even when my consciousness is veering off of center, it never veers so far off that I don't know that there's a higher truth, which is actually a great comfort. One of the things that was so meaningful to me when I first came on the spiritual path was finally there was a line against which everything could be measured. And prior to that, one of the multitudes of things that made me so nervous about how I was going to live in this world was I could not find a fixed point of reference. And so first that fixed point of reference was the teachings of self-realization itself, as I began to learn them through the Ramakrishna line. Then it became literally Swami Kriyananda, whose vibration of consciousness during his lifetime and ever after, the vibration of Swami's consciousness defines for me the note I'm trying to sing. And I can measure all the notes that my karma takes me by whether or not they are in harmony with that note. It doesn't have to be the same note, but it has to harmonize with that note. And when it doesn't, when I allow my countless karmic vrittis to suck me in, sooner or later, and by the grace of God, much of the time sooner, but not always, but sooner or later, that dissonance makes itself known. And even though that dissonance is very unpleasant and oftentimes humiliating on every level, I'm deeply grateful for it. Just deeply grateful because there's a pole star. There's a point of reference. Pole star is one of my favorite phrases for God, for Guru, because it's just the fixed point, and you can always tell where you are on the great ocean of life by seeing yourself in reference to that fixed point, and you can always find your way back to where you want to be in reference to that fixed point. So, now moving along with number 453 of conversations. Now, last week we talked about Master, the one in 452. There was this story about how Master and others, Master went to this other church in which the preacher was ordering them all down on their knees because they were sinners, and I speculated that that was probably the church of Aimee Semple McPherson. So now, in 453, Swami says, when Aimee Semple McPherson, who may have been the evangelist in the foregoing story, which is probably why I thought it was, was reportedly lost for a time in the Mexican desert, malicious persons spread the gossip that she had disappeared for reasons not altogether praiseworthy. The master defended her staunchly. "Look at the good she has done," he protested. "Let God be the judge. But let us be grateful also that she has done so much for others." Last week when I was referring to Aimee Semple, I remembered truly that I'd read a biography about her, the title of it, which I don't know, being a person who's devoted myself to spiritual teachings. I'm often interested in others who have done so, especially a pioneering woman, because the apex of her life experience was the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, so she was a real pioneering woman. And there was I reviewed a little bit of her life story, which I knew, and I want to reference what Master's referring to here. Aimee Semple McPherson started something called the Foursquare Gospel Church, and it was in Los Angeles, and it was in the 20s and 30s, so Master would have known her. She was phenomenally popular. Her church, she built this beautiful place called the Angelus Temple, in which had 10,000 members. It was the largest. It was way before megachurches. I mean, this is long before internet, or just before what we're used to now. And the Pentecostal religion, so to speak, was not even that well known. She, to a very large extent, sort of helped establish a lot of the evangelical movement that has existed ever since. And her own life story, was interesting. She married actually 3 different times. Once her husband died, and twice the marriage broke up. The first time the marriage broke up was when she became very ill and became convinced that she was being called by God to be a preacher. And she just had to do it. Excuse me, that might have been the second time. The first husband died. The second time, she left because she knew that she was not doing what God had asked her to do, and she had to do it. She was raised, her mother was part of the Salvation Army, so she was raised kind of in the tradition of witnessing for God and serving others in the name of Jesus. And she must have been quite something, because she drew tens of thousands of people. She was the most popular by any measurement. She built this big temple, and she used very modern methods. Every week she would write original religious drama, and she would draw on Hollywood people for costumes and sets and music. So then thousands of people would flock to hear her speak. And even though Master refers in the previous story, assuming it was her, to hellfire and brimstone, actually her emphasis was always was much more on heaven than it was on hell. But she was campaigning in that sort of way. Well, what happened, and she did tremendous amount of good work. She did relief work when there was difficulty. She ran a huge soup kitchen in which she just helped hundreds of people for years, and she brought all these other workers and students in to help. And she was quite a remarkable woman, and she was married. Her first mission, the husband went with her for a while, but then he couldn't do it, and he separated from her. The second marriage also ended in divorce. But most of the time, she was herself just doing this mission, which is no small thing, especially during those times. But what happened at a certain point is she disappeared, and she disappeared for 6 weeks. And she had gone to the beach, and then she had disappeared. And finally, they searched for her in various ways, and finally they couldn't find her anywhere, and her mother gave up and decided she must be dead. And they were about to have a funeral service for her, a memorial service for her, when word came that she was in a hospital in Arizona. And the story that she told was that she'd been kidnapped, that she was on the beach, and a couple had asked her, as she put it, as the story was, invited her to come and pray for their sick child, but instead they kidnapped her and, bound her and drugged her and took her into Mexico, and it was 6 weeks before she was able to get back. Now, who knows why? Instead, she was accused of having taken a lover and run off with the lover. and the man was named, and all of these things happened. The newspapers kept it enormously alive. The newspapers put a lot of money behind doing an investigation. Eventually there's a grand jury investigation, and she's actually put on trial for this. The exact charges are a little obscure to me, but whatever it was, where she could have gone to jail for like 40 years for whatever it was. They named the man who was supposedly her lover, who had been, in fact, with the woman in Mexico, but eventually he named the woman and showed who it was, and it wasn't her. But this gigantic scandal takes place, and when they finally had the trial, the prosecution case, as it was reported, just began to fall to pieces, and there was just simply no way to prove. Now, was she in fact kidnapped? Did she in fact go off for some other reason? Master himself doesn't say. And what he says here is, look at the good she has done. If she's done something wrong, let God judge it. Let us really just commend her for the good. Now, what's so fascinating about this, there were multiple levels of it that just super interested me, which is, first of all, even if, let's say, she fell in love with someone and went off and had an affair, which is, completely outside of the context of what she was doing, why would the world be so quick to condemn her? This is what Master's saying. Like, this woman has dedicated her life to doing good and has done, unbelievable amounts of service, both spiritually and materially, to people in need for decades. She sacrificed enormously to give her life to this. But one little potential footfall, and the world rushes in to tear her to pieces. So it's so beautiful. I mean, this was undoubtedly controversial. And whether Master, with his superconscious sight, could actually know what the truth of the matter was or it wasn't, he took the trouble, even at the time. It wasn't that he just said this here. Master spoke up for her publicly. He spoke publicly and chastised people for forgetting all the good that she's done in the desire to tear her to pieces because some human foible, assuming even the worst, some human foible. She hadn't gone off to be evil. She had just gone off for her own personal satisfaction, at worst, and then was embarrassed to mention it. None of which, let's assume that, because that's what was claimed, let's assume that that was what she did. Why does the world then turn and tear her to pieces? Her whole preaching reality had been, all sinners can be saved by God. God is a God of love. Why would people not remember that? And why would people find such glee? Why would the newspapers, perpetrate the scandal? Well, of course, it's obvious why they would. Master spoke often against yellow journalism. He really didn't have a lot positive to say for that kind of effort. But one, Master's standing up for her. And two, isn't it amazing how karma works? Because now that's the other side of it. One side of it is this glee to sort of see the mighty pulled down. The other is just how everything has to come back to zero sooner or later. This is something that Swami has mentioned to us so many times, and I still honestly can't quite get my mind around it. But he says, every success has to be balanced by a failure, and all of the ups and downs of karma have to come balance back at zero. Now, I think where this sort of changes a little is when action is done for, well, now I'm beyond myself to say it. I can't quite understand it, so I'm not going to try. But I am going to say how often in the life of great souls, this great good, this great adulation comes, and then something attacks them and tries to pull them down. You see, that happened to Master also. I started out by talking about Yogananda and about the whole cycle that took place where he was sued. Well, Master was accused of running a love nest and, of all kinds of immoralities. And, the newspapers got a hold of it and had a heyday with it to prove that he wasn't really what he appeared to be. And everybody wants to think, especially these days, In the 40s it was bad, but now it's a national sport to try to find the worst about people and make sure that everyone is defined by the worst that they are. And the other side of it, and this is what I was saying with how often great souls have to suffer. And here's part of it, and this is actually because, you see, it happened to Ananda. It happened to Swami Kriyananda. Swami Kriyananda was vilified through this lawsuit that was filed in 1994 and wasn't settled until 1998. And actually, a verdict was rendered against Ananda. A woman accused Ananda of being a sham religion. She herself had a consensual affair with a married man. When the married man decided he wanted to stay with his wife, Swami Kriyananda supported the man in that decision. He did not order the man to do it, but when the man made the decision, Swami supported him in it and told the woman that she couldn't stay in the same community with him. It wasn't fair. And he asked her to leave. And she went away, but she went away mad. And eventually found a way to get her revenge through a lawsuit in which she claimed, literally, that in the meditation class she'd taken, in the first 30 minutes of a meditation class she'd taken, actually as it happened, taken here in Palo Alto, not from me personally, but from one of the other teachers here, that she'd been hypnotized, and that she remained hypnotized for maybe, I don't know how long, was it 4 years, 5 years that she was part of Ananda? She remained in a state of hypnosis during that entire time, and therefore wasn't responsible for anything that she did until she came out of the hypnosis, when she finally escaped from the cult. And that Swami Kriyananda led a conspiracy in which women were second-class citizens and were the sex slaves of the men, and that Ananda was a sham organization, and it was only there set up, literally, and I'm quoting, to stock the harem of the Swami. It was pretty impressive. And we had a trial that went on for many weeks, and we had a lot of negative publicity. I tell this story both in Lightbearer and also in Swami Kriyananda as we have known him. It was not pretty. And in the end, for various reasons, we did not have an attorney who knew how to defend us properly, and the jury voted like 8-4, I guess, to hold us responsible. And one of the reasons they held us responsible was because when the married man, whose marriage was under stress for a lot of reasons, resolved to go back to his wife and to try to make a success of his marriage, we allowed him to do that. We, the greater Ananda, we allowed him to do that, rather than denouncing him publicly, humiliating him, and expelling him from Ananda forever. And it took me a while, going through that legal situation, to actually realize that that's what we were being accused of, among other things. But one of the points that the opposing attorney just pounded in was the fact that we treated him charitably, and not only for his sake, but for the sake of his wife and his child. We tried to support him. He had admitted his weakness. There was no secret about that, but we supported him. And we also did not publicize it because there was a wife and child involved. And we did it to spare their feelings, and Swami also did it because, as he put it, in these matters, sympathy tends to go toward the wife and not toward the other woman. So, since the other woman had left one Ananda community, but at that time was still part of another community, he also did it to spare her, because it would not have gone down well for her to have been exposed for what she had done. Okay? But we were supposed to have treated them all brutally. And because we hadn't treated them brutally, we were considered to be morally reprehensible. And were judged so in the end, for reasons that had very little to do with the facts, but just had to do with attorneys. and the legal system. But that's a whole nother question. That's not what I'm going to talk about. But when I finally figured out what they had wanted us to do, I remember I gave a sermon at our church, and I have no idea what date it was. But I said, I would rather lose everything than become that kind of an organization. If we can't look to each other with compassion and charity, and, this was not a matter of, a serial predator or something like that. This was a very good man and a good woman. Everybody involved. Well, the woman turned out to be not so good, but at the time we thought she was okay. People doing their sincere best, but not being God realized. And what kind of a world will we be if when people slip, we kick them when they're down and then try to bury them 6 feet under? Would any of us ever really be able to rise to the level that we're striving to seek, we're seeking to achieve? And I said in church, I would rather lose everything than behave the way they're trying to tell us we're supposed to behave. I got a standing ovation. It's the only time, and it probably will never happen again. But I felt it very strongly in my heart. And this is what Master's trying to say. And it doesn't lower your standards to try to help people. In fact, charity is, and kindness. I'm not talking about being naive. I'm not talking about, letting evil people have sway in the name of charity. Not at all. Sometimes you really have to stand up and take a stand. But kindness is also a divine law, and Divine Mother's all-forgiving nature has to also be considered. And I find it very touching that Master took the trouble to speak up for this woman who had done decades of selfless service to the whole world. It's very important to remember that that's how Master behaved. Now, one thing also I wanted to say, though, in this context, when Ananda was attacked in this way, and we actually had 12 years of legal persecution, which was theological dispute, and then we had a character assassination dispute. There were 2 lawsuits that were actually the same lawsuit, but they were actually 2 different actions. The details are unimportant in this context. But some people wanted to say, what have we done wrong? We should have a day of atonement. We should have a day of introspection. This wouldn't be happening to us if we weren't guilty, basically, because of the obvious law of karma, which is that things come to you for a reason. But Swamiji's take on it was really quite different. When people wanted to sort of introspect as to what we had all done wrong to bring this down on our heads, his response was absolutely not, which was actually just a little startling because a certain reading of the law of karma would have you think about it differently. He says, and this is how I tended to explain it, and I wrote it in The Light Bearer. These are not all Swami's words, but this is how I wrote it. This is, of course, the book that I always like to hold up. This is the book of my 45 years with Swamiji. It's a very interesting book. People really like it. You can get it everywhere. That you can order books online, which is the only way we shop now. But what Swami said is, there's such a thing as persecution, which is not really negative karma, it's actually very good karma. Because, as Swami put it beautifully, he said, the quality of consciousness at Ananda, the nobility of consciousness, the generosity of heart, the elevatedness of Ananda as a whole, which I myself have to attest to. I've never seen such a dedicated group of high-minded individuals. He said it would be only natural that God would want to test us, to make us even stronger in our good qualities. And so what we're being asked to be is to face into persecution and to elevate our consciousness even above and beyond that with our faith in God and our belief in what we're doing, and not to succumb, just the opposite, not to succumb to people's accusations. That's why what I finally understood people were asking of us, they were criticizing us for having allowed this to happen and not coming down harshly on people because we were lax. No, we weren't lax, we were charitable. because we believe in each other's, and we believe in each other's ultimate freedom, and we do not believe that we are sinners. We believe that we are gold. This was what I was talking last week. And yeah, we do fall in the mud every once in a while. But as brothers and sisters, it behooves us to lift each other out and hose each other off and offer the appropriate, clear advice. And sometimes that advice may be very stern. I'm not saying there's not a place for it, but it's not in and of itself of value. The point is to help people. And every decision should be made on the basis of what will help them. And sometimes very hard action is required because that's what will help them. It was very interesting because this woman actually won that lawsuit, won a bunch of money from us. And when we were sitting there and the verdict came in, actually, my own reaction really surprised me, and I was very pleased about it. Because my first thought, as soon as I realized that she had won, which was not unexpected because we did not feel that our attorney really presented a winning case. It was as simple as that. I think there was a winning case, but he didn't present it. That was our karma in the situation. I also talk about that in Light Bearer. It's a very interesting story. But when the verdict went in her favor, my first thought was, oh, that poor woman. That's really what I thought. I said, not only has she perpetrated this completely false lawsuit, because, it was a family. We all knew what the real story was. We knew the real story really well, and we knew that what she was presenting simply wasn't true. But I thought, oh my gosh, not only has she fabricated this story, but now she's won, which will just reinforce ever more profoundly in her mind that she's a poor victim, and that she was justified in the whole story. And it'll take her even that much longer to get out of this whole thing. And that's how I've remained. It was just like, you poor thing. We could have appealed the case, and as many legal people said to us, there was so much judicial error. One attorney said to us that verdict had the shelf life of an apple, was what he said. But appeals are complicated because what you actually win, you're not exonerated by an appeal. You just get the right to have a new trial. And the absolute last thing we wanted was a new trial. Plus we were actually almost literally bankrupt at that point and had to file Chapter 11. And there were a whole lot of other reasons. I talk about it in there. So we let the verdict stand because we had to. We really couldn't see a way out of it. We just kind of went, I am who I am before my conscience and God. But having said all of that, I'm very, very touched by Master coming to the fore in a very unpopular cause. I know this woman I'm going to stand up for, and I'm sure Master was criticized for that. I'm sure that when he put himself forward, I suspect when he put himself forward, they brought forward whatever troubles had been behind him, if the timing was such. Maybe this was before. I could be wrong about that because it could have been before. But he defended her. Master was very loyal to his friends, and he defended her. I think that's beautiful. Master also defended, was his name King Edward, the the King of England, who abdicated in order to marry Wallis Simpson. Master also defended him, and he defended Wallis Simpson. She'd been, I believe, divorced, I think, more than once. And what Master said about her, I've been told this, that Master publicly defended her willingness still to believe in love, even though she'd been disappointed, that she was still willing to go forward and give her heart. And that he defended their right to their happiness. Isn't it fascinating? I love that. I absolutely love that. There was an incident in the history of Ananda quite a long time ago, people that almost none of you would know. But there was a person, I'll just keep the genders not specific, person 1 was unhappily married and fell in love with person 2. And for quite a number of years, person 1 did everything possible to make their marriage a success. But after 6 or 7 years, it was quite some time, person 1 just said to Swami, it's not working. Like this is just, it's not working for me. my heart belongs to person 2. During that whole period of time, there was no relationship between them. But person 1 just said, I can't do it anymore. And Swami said, okay. And it was earlier in Ananda's history when we ourselves were not as clear about what charity, what kindness was, what morality, what human nature was really like, how when we had to sympathize and someone said, well, this is bad for the community for person 1 to do this. And Swami's answer was, person 1 gave years of their life and did their best. He said, that person owes nothing more than that to the community. They don't owe their whole life to the community. Just so realistic and so charitable. And Swami's own comment, you have to understand this in the right way, not saying that licentiousness or lack of dharma, betrayal of any kind, or failing to live up to our highest aspirations is a good thing. But Swami said, these things happen. Just like that. You can't always control the feelings of the heart, is what he said. And he didn't say it either endorsing or condemning. He's just observing. You can't always control the feelings of the heart. And we have to realize that about ourselves and one another. Because sometimes, of course, the harshest judgments come from those who are most afraid of their own weaknesses. And the way to protect ourselves from our own weaknesses is not by creating a fierce judgment outside ourselves. In The Light Bearer, I also talk about this because it was a very important learning for our whole community. So that book, going year by year, I had to talk about what Swami taught us, what we tried to learn from him every year. And one of it was that kind of judgment where there's an unforgiving attitude toward weakness, and the individual who expresses that kind of unforgiving attitude toward weakness, the damage they do is to themselves. Because inevitably, when we are judgmental and act with a lack of compassion, the karmic cycle will come around and it will be necessary for us to learn compassion. And usually the way we learn compassion is that we ourselves fall into, we get to live out whatever we judged. Whatever we did not have compassion for, whatever we did not have understanding for, we get to experience it from the other side. If you steal someone's inheritance, you're likely to lose your own. Just many things can happen. And that's how the karmic law works. We're here, we have to learn something. We thought we could take happiness in a certain way. And often we take happiness by judging others harshly and feeling so self-righteous about it. And that helps protect us from our own temptation because we've laid down this ironclad law. But insofar as that is lack of compassion and lack of understanding, that weakness in ourselves has to be overcome. But if we've set up in our minds that such things cannot be forgiven, and then we find ourselves overcome and acting out in the very ways that we have condemned, not only do we have to deal with the consequences of our own behavior, but we have this voice of harsh condemnation inside our own heads that is pounding on us even as we try to recover. And that's really the worst of it. The absolute worst of it is that we are subjected to our own lack of forgiveness. And then we are subjected to our own belief that now we have to be flung out into outer darkness and God no longer loves us. All of which are much worse karmas than the mere weakness of desire, whatever that desire might be, for money or sex or personal love or whatever it might be. Those desires are unfortunate, but they're not as hard to overcome as the belief that now I have failed and God will not love me. So that's why Master stood up. There was a lot at stake. And that's why Swami stood up. There was a lot at stake. And isn't it interesting how often souls with great good spiritual karma get to be vilified and globally humiliated and often convicted and punished because God wants to test their mettle. Will you love me just as much? Will you surrender to me just as much, even if the world absolutely turns its back on you? Why do I love God? Because everybody loves me? What if nobody loves me? What if everyone tells me that I'm wrong? This is martyrdom. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate it, but it is martyrdom. That's exactly what it is. It was very interesting. This is only tangentially related, but when St. Anthony was called from the desert by the church authorities to help stand up for the divinity of Christ, and it was also a time when Christians were being martyred, St. Anthony, where I believe where this was taking place in the Colosseum, perhaps in Rome, I may have the details wrong, but the essence of the story is true. Christians were being martyred, and Anthony would visit them just before their martyrdom, and their martyrdom, I believe, was being eaten by lions, and he was able to just walk in and out by his spiritual power, I guess. And he just comforted people. He didn't help them escape, and he didn't protest against what was happening to them. He just comforted them and assured them that if they were faithful to God, God would be faithful to them. The ordeal was going to be the ordeal, but he spoke of it as a privilege or a necessary sacrifice. Master said something interesting. He said, speaking of Christians being eaten by lions or whatever those other god-awful things, or burned at the stake, things that happen, Master said, if one enters into martyrdom like that with faith in God, it's not a painful death. God spares you the pain. That's quite a statement, isn't it? I have no way to say, I have no way of knowing what that means. But it's very touching. I mean, touching beyond touching. The only thing that matters is faithfulness to God. A little bit of physical pain, or a lot of physical pain, could be very unpleasant. But once you're out of the body, it's gone. It's short-lived. But if we betray our highest ideals, and if we're unfaithful to God out of fear, that's a pain that'll stay with us. Physical body will die, and that pain will just be as intense, even more so. The spiritual path is not effortless. And it requires a lot of serious commitment, which is, what we're all trying to find. I remember a few years onto the spiritual path when I was living at Ananda village. I was part of the monastery then. There was, our monastery grew quite large, to maybe 25 women at one point, but the core of it was less than 10. And this, I think, was in one of those periods. We were a very, very tight-knit group of women who still remain in many, many ways, my closest spiritual allies, even though, thank you God, many other relationships have been added on top of it. But there was something really strong that happened with us. I remember 5 or 6 years onto the path, really beginning to understand what I'd gotten myself into. Now, I don't mean in that sense that I regretted it, but it was impossible for me to know when I started, because I just didn't have the breadth or the depth, I mean, not even fractionally, of what it really meant to seek God. I was up for it. It's not that I haven't stumbled or fallen quite a few times in the intervening years, but I've never given up, and I've never even thought about giving up. But I have been very impressed as time passes, in each few years or a decade or a 12-year cycle. And all of a sudden you say, oh, I see. Then you keep looking up and keep looking up and keep looking up. And then you realize, oh yes, I see. This is really magnificent. This is magnificent. It's the most magnificent story, beyond imagination of expectancy. In his poem Samadhi, Master speaks of Samadhi as enjoyable beyond imagination of expectancy. Such brilliant wordsmithing, you just cannot help but just stand back and admire it. but beyond imagination of expectancy. Just those three words together, that's what the path is. The spiritual path is beyond imagination of expectancy, both in the joy that it gives you and also what it means to really surrender everything and give up your ego. It sounds good in theory until you're actually there. Sister Yogananda, in her wonderful book of letters, God Alone, she says that she gradually came to understand that she had to surrender everything, including those things that were mine by right that harmed no one. And she just realized that there's just everything, every tiny bit of self-identity has to be given up. It's just like that. I've had experiences since I've been in this seclusion. Just everything is so stark because there's so little going on and there's so zero opportunity. I loved, you have so much humor on the internet right now. Where shall I spend Easter? In the living room or in the kitchen? It's just like, that's all the things that we would normally think about. Where shall we have Easter supper? Shall we have it in the bedroom or in the dining room? It's like there's no place to go. So everything is very stark, which is a great help. And, I watch myself oscillate in and out of greater and lesser, not on or off, but greater or lesser self-preoccupation and self-concern. And self-preoccupation is very tiresome. So it's painful. And we have to repudiate it if we're going to be free. It appears that we have some questions, so maybe we'll hear what the question is.
If God is all-powerful and omniscient, without testing us, He can know the degree of our sincerity and spirituality, so why does He need to test us?
Oh, the question is, why does God test us if He knows who we are? Is this microphone pick up your voice?
No, that was
okay. So the question is, if God knows who we are, why does He test us? Oh, He's not testing us for His sake. He's testing us for ours, because we don't know who we are. And so we ourselves have a very limited concept of our endurance. So we risk very little, and our self-concept is really very small. And so it would be natural when God sees how sincere we are that He would say, well, I could make you even better. You have the potential. It's sort of like a coach seeing an athlete with a lot of potential, and he says, come to my team and I'll make you a really great player. And then the guy says, sure, I'll go and do that. And then the coach just drives him to within an inch of his life. And the player thinks, why did I ever sign up for this? This is just crazy. But the coach knows what he's capable of doing and will not let him off. And then somehow the player, somehow or another, recognizes his own potential, maybe because the coach has faith in him, maybe because he's beginning to realize, I didn't think I could do that, but look at that, I can. And then you see, think how it changes us. I certainly know, because of some of the very, very difficult things God has put me through in my life, that I have so much more courage than I ever had before. And I'm just so much less of a, I guess the word is wuss, just even in my self-concept. I was always so nervous, so insecure about my own capabilities. So God knew me better than I knew myself, and He pushed me way past what I thought I was capable of doing. But somehow, by grace, the subtle form of grace, which just kind of comes to you as this, well, it comes to you in two ways. It comes to you as the sudden realization that I can do it, and it also comes to you backwards, which is, I have to do this. I remember once I finally had to acknowledge I was so mad at God. That doesn't happen to me really often, but it was mostly one day I finally figured out, I was looking at the altar. I was mad at everyone on that altar, every single one of them. And the reason I was so mad at them is because the test that they had put in front of me, which was horrible and huge, I was just going to have to figure out how to face it. And it was the fact that I was going to have to do it that made me so mad. Not that they'd sent it to me, but because I knew I was going to have to do it. And I knew it was going to be long and it was going to be really hard. But I did it. And I can still be nervous, but I also can remember, wow, honey, if you could make it through that, you could make it through a lot. And things that used to look big don't look so very big to me anymore. That's why God does it. There's another question?
That was both of them rolled into
Oh,
one.
both of them rolled into one. Okay. Good question. Because it's a very important articulation.
Oh, we just got another one.
Okay, here's another.
Is it that God is testing us or just unresolved karma that we need to transcend? Perhaps as we become closer to freedom, the karmas that are left are just harder to overcome, so look more God, quote, testing us.
The question is God testing it, or is it just karma that we have to overcome? And the closer we get to freedom, the more God tests us, because what? There's just so little.
Maybe there's just more karma left to overcome.
Oh, there's more karma left to overcome. I find it hard to sort of quantify it all like that. The difference between God testing us and it being our own karma is just an intellectual decision and a matter of vocabulary. People, different temperaments like to think about things in different ways, and on different days I like to think about it on different ways, and you can just say it one way or you can say it another way, but you're saying the same thing. The point that we're trying to say is that what comes to us is exactly what we need. And if we want to think about it in terms, I find, the whole picture of karma, which I've talked about here many times. If you go to my YouTube channel and just type in karma, you'll find so many classes. It'll keep you entertained, perhaps even to the end of this shelter in place. But anyway, you can learn a lot about karma from there and many other places. I find understanding the law of karma to be extremely helpful because I have a picture of it. But the law of karma is actually the divine law set up by God. And so you can say that God is testing us by, let me just think how to say this properly. Karma is unlearned lessons. That's one of the ways that I think it works. Karma is also in the Bible when they talk about sin. When Jesus was the only one who was born without sin. What that means, he was born without karma, which was he was a realized master and he had perfect understanding of divine law, of everything, of Sanatana Dharma, he was one with God, he had perfect understanding, because sin also means ignorance, which is a good way to think about, if you want to use the word sin, think of it as ignorance. That's also in this book. So Jesus was born without ignorance. He understood perfectly the nature of creation. We're ignorant about the nature of creation, and everything that we're ignorant about, we eventually have to come to understand and learn. What I love to call alternate theory of happiness, other than complete transcendence of the ego and surrender to God, has to be faced and overcome. That's an unlearned lesson. Every alternate theory of happiness is, I think I need this to be happy, and when in fact, God alone is the answer to everything, and that alternate theory of happiness has to be tested because it's an unlearned lesson. And we have to learn it, and that's karma. Now, if we just want to think about karma without having a loving, conscious mother and divine father who's taking care of us, I think it's kind of dry and lonely. You can try to spin it out like that, but I think it's kind of dry and lonely. It doesn't really inspire my heart just to think of it as the impersonal working out of cause and effect, even though it actually is the impersonal working out of cause and effect. It's more dynamic. It inspires me more. It gives me more strength and more hope if I can feel that there is a loving divine mother who's taking me through this. Now, but God himself has to work through our karma. It's an interplay. There's we have a temperament, And we have incarnations that we have an inclination that's setting us up in a certain way, and no two snowflakes are alike, and everybody's consciousness is unique. But it works better for me to have God be holding my hand and leading me through it, rather than me just being tossed on the stormy sea and have all the waves hit me like this. This is the different paths of yoga. And the path, the bhakti path, the love of God, to my experience, makes it possible to proceed. So even as I was there being so mad at every one of those gurus for doing this to me, it was the temper tantrum you have with the people that you love, because you know they're doing it for your own good, and it just gives me strength. Now we have to understand that I'm using creative imagination to put myself in tune with something that's actually there. When I used to teach the beginning meditation classes, which I did for many years here in Palo Alto and in other places, I would, at a certain, like in the second class usually, I would say meditation is a relationship. We think of it as going inside, and we think about it being in solitude, but you're not. It's a relationship with a greater reality. And then I would talk to people about what that greater reality is. This morning in the broadcast, the 9 a.m. broadcast, I talked about the 8 manifestations of God: love, peace, joy, calmness, wisdom, light, sound, energy. Maybe I didn't get 8 there, but that's what they are. And I would talk about the way God comes to us. He comes to us as love. He comes to us as peace. He comes to us as joy. He comes to us as this overwhelming, uplifting power that and He comes to us as light. He comes to us as Om. These are real experiences of a reality that isn't just inside our own mind. So when you're meditating, you use your imagination to put you in tune with that wavelength, but it's not like a visualization where you think, oh, now I'm wandering on the beach, and now this beautiful white horse comes, and now I get on the back of the horse and we're galloping bareback down the beach. And that such things may give you an expansive feeling, they may relax you, they have value. I'm not saying they don't have value, but what we're doing when we meditate is we're using our creative imagination to actually put our vibration in tune with the reality that's actually there. And so what happens is when we get aligned, suddenly grace comes and actually changes us, because there is this power that is following us. So yes, it's our karma, and the divine works with our karma. You know, it doesn't, if you're a musician, you're not suddenly going to have tests that are based on mathematics. If you're a mathematician, you're not going to have tests that are based on music. You know, it's just like who you are, you'll be tested in that way, and what is appropriate for you, what you don't know. If it's money you don't understand, that's how you'll be tested. If it's human love, that's how you'll be tested. But there's a divine power that is leading us. So yes, and, both and. Swamiji said when he first came to Master's teaching, it was very confusing for him because he was schooled on the Western way of thinking, where it's either or. It's either this or it's that. Aristotelian logic, I think, is the phrase he used, which I am quoting because I am very uneducated I am extremely well educated in a very narrow sphere, but I do not have a broad education. Swami had a very broad education. I dropped out of college. I joined Ananda. I've learned a lot, but I learned it all from Swami. But the logic that says, if it's this, it can't be that, and if it's that, it can't be this. And then Swami came into the Indian philosophy, where it's possible that many things are both and. God is both formless and not formless. It's the law of karma, and it's God acting. It's God testing you, and it's your own karma testing you. It's both and. It just depends on which side of the diamond you're looking at and how you describe it. In the path, Swami actually talks about how when he was with Master and Master was interpreting the Bhagavad Gita, Swami writes about it. He said it was a terrible test for him because Master would say, this is what it means. And then on the other hand, this is what it means. And then yet again, this is what it means. And he said, in India, the scholars would actually have competitions to see how many different interpretations they could get from one verse of the Bhagavad Gita. And the more diverse interpretations they could get, they were all inherent in the verse, the more brilliant the scholar was considered to be. Where in the West, we try to just want to know exactly what the definition is. But that then just takes a huge reality and reduces it to less than it actually is. So depending on who you are, and depending on the day of the week, depending on the particular cycle of your own karma, sometimes it's better to think of it one way, sometimes it's better to think of the other. And the more we can relax with these different things, the more doors it opens for us. And the less rigid our self-definition becomes. I am a person who, well, sometimes I'm a person who does this, sometimes I'm a person who does that. Like, who knows? I'm going to tell a story about a friend of mine. I won't say her name, although some of you know her. She and I were back when I was speaking of nuns together, and we were such renunciates. We were just incredible renunciates. Really, at that time, both circumstances compelled us to be, and we were austere. And as we have both grown older and various things have happened, I myself, it's about the age of 60 is when a woman really begins to shift. And during that period of time, you're not supposed to ever touch your face. During that period of time, when I began to look different than I had looked when I was younger, almost every time I got a haircut, I went to a different hairdresser because I kept thinking that the hairdresser wasn't able to make me look as attractive as I used to look. And it took me longer than you would think to realize two things. First of all, one hairdresser finally said to me, "Honey, everything gets older, including your hair." So one of the things was, your hair is just not going to do what it used to do because your hair is a little worn out, just like the rest of you. Then the other thing I realized was, it wasn't my hair, it was my face. I remember during that period of time, the women in the audience will enjoy this, during this period of time, I went shopping. This was before I was a Nayaswami, when I used to be able to go shopping and buy anything I wanted to buy. It was a beautiful dress. I just loved this dress, and I put it on, and it fit me perfectly. But the problem was, in order for me to wear it, as when I came out and talked to my friends about why I wasn't going to buy it, I said, the dress is just perfect, but in order to wear it, I need a different head. And the chances of my getting a different head did not seem high, so I really thought I shouldn't buy the dress. We just didn't match. My taste still matched it, but we didn't match like that. So that was, but what was fascinating to me also, when I watched myself age, I was astonished that I noticed, and that it actually affected me, that I was trying to figure out a way to not have it go. I should add to this, and this is part of this story, this is my natural hair color. Even though I'm 72 years old, this is my natural hair color. If it was white, trust me, it would be white. I just don't have it in me to do anything about it, but it's just never changed. And my father died in his 80s with hair this color, so it's possible, who knows. All three of us siblings have this genetic reality. So moving on with that, let's see, where was I with it? Oh, it was amazing to me that I noticed and that a part of me cared. And I thought to myself, Asha, how many bodies have you had? And probably many of them aged. Like, why would it matter? And it was fascinating to me, but one small little sort of weird comfort that made me not really know how to think about this. In Autobiography of a Yogi, one of the really incredible chapters is the resurrection of Sri Yukteswar. And he talks about the astral world in there. Let's see now, I want to finish the story about my friend, but I'm going to digress a little bit. In that chapter, Sri Yukteswar says that when you go to the astral world, almost everyone makes a body of like about in their mid-20s. That's what everybody looks like. And they make a body, who knows, that's similar, that's recognizable, but that's the age that most people are in the astral world. Sri Yukteswar says that he was unusual because he preferred to keep an older body. And so he describes himself as being a savior on a very high astral planet called Hiranyaloka, in which as Sri Yukteswar said, the people are so advanced that they don't find his teaching as difficult to accept as they did when on planet Earth, because Sri Yukteswar was a bit of a taskmaster and therefore was not as popular a guru, is how Yogananda puts it, as he might have been if he'd been milder. But when I heard that, when you go to the astral world, like 25 years old is who you think you are. And I can't claim that that's what I was relating to, because personal vanity simply played a part in it. I'm not super big on personal vanity, but I'm definitely not without it. There's no question about it. But I also realized maybe there was actually some actual memory or just feeling that this body doesn't look right to me anymore. You know, what looks right is a 25-year-old body, because that's the one I'm going to have when I'm no longer subject to the material world, when I'm going to be able to choose. It'll just be new and bright and, energetic like that. So all of this is to say, and I'm talking about, just accepting ourselves in the way we are. So my friend, who was just as much of a renunciate as I, even perhaps more so, when her hair began to turn white, she started dyeing it. And she's been dyeing her hair for really a long, long time. She's the same age. She's actually a few years older than me. She looks very attractive. She's very, very energetic, has super health. And, so having that dark hair probably reinforces in her, this sense of youth. And that's the first time I ever thought about that. But I said to her, I said, when we were in our 20s and we were young nuns together, I would have bet $100 million that you would never dye your hair, that you just wouldn't do something like that. Bless her heart, she smiled at me and said, so would I. She said, I would have bet the same money as you. Odd, isn't it? And that was it. It's like, I don't have to be consistent. This is just who I am. So what? Many things can all be true at the same time, and this is how we need to live. This is what Swamiji he was so flexible in his mind, and he was so little compelled by the details. He would just go right to the heart of the matter. There was this woman who was hard for a lot of us to deal with. And Swami just remarked, he said, don't you just love how intense she is about everything she does? And I had to say, no, sir, love is not the first word that springs to mind. But he just thought about it like, look at what a fine quality is. And I was working with this other person that I found very difficult to be with because they were overbearing. Now, of course, I found it difficult to be with them because I, too, am overbearing. And when you get two overbearing people together, something has to give. That was the subplot of this conversation with Swami. But I said to him about so-and-so and that I find it difficult to be with them because they're just, they're so overbearing. And Swami said, I know just what you mean. I said, I find that person exactly the same way. He said, so when I'm with them, Swami said, I just don't bother to have a personality. I thought, what incredible freedom. So that person wants to fill all the space with their personality. Swami just thought, who cares? Let them. Like, why do I have to assert myself against their desire to assert themselves? He wasn't talking about moral principles or anything like that. He was just talking about personality. It was tremendous advice to me, and I began to relate to the person completely differently. If you want to have all the pigeons in the room and you just want to be the one who fills all the space, go ahead. What difference does it make to me? But until Swami put it to me that way, I just from habit, I kept thinking I had to be somebody too. This is who we're really trying to be. We're just trying to be here for one another and be many different things at the same time, and we don't have to be consistent. The only thing we have to be consistent in is our devotion to God. And if we're consistent in that, everything else will follow. God bless you, my friends.